questions. I don't know how to.
Pleasure.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you all for being here. Welcome to the second annual Sabina Miller Memorial Lecture. My name is Sandra Miller, and I'm really delighted that you're joining us this evening. My mum, Sabina, was a member of this synagogue for well over 50 years. She was a Holocaust survivor, and during the latter years of her life, she decided to tell her story, to warn about the dangers of hatred, and to share the importance of tolerance, compassion, and kindness. I always promised my mum that I would continue to tell her story. And when lockdown happened, I joined an organization called Generation to Generation, which allows the children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors to tell their family histories. In 2021, I presented Mum's story to the synagogue, and they very kindly decided to honor Mum with an annual lecture in her name. Henry Grunwald was one of my mum's favorite people. Whenever we were at an event or a function and Henry was present, my mum wouldn't allow us to leave until Henry had greeted her, preferably with a kiss. I'm very happy to hand over to Henry, who's going to introduce our speaker tonight.
Sandra, thank you so much. Mum was a very, very special person, and I look into the ladies' gallery and I can still see her sitting there. And she did, as you say, in her latter years, spend so much time giving the benefit of her story to teach children, adults who knew very little about it, what the Holocaust was, what her part in it had been. And she did it so well. She worked particularly with the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust, and Olivia Marks-Waldman, who's their CEO, is here with us tonight. And I was a trustee of that for some time, and that's when I really got to know her, and always tried to make sure that when she came somewhere to speak, that she was treated with the respect and dignity and love that frankly she deserved. And I'm sorry, some of you will have heard me say this in the past, but there was one wonderful occasion, I think it was Holocaust Memorial Day 2015, when there were various events during that day in which she took a very strong role. And we managed to have her photographed with the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, and the Leader of the Opposition in separate places and events, all on the same day. And I think she loved that, and we certainly loved to have been able to do that for her. And she, I know, would have listened with great eagerness to our speaker tonight, to Jonathan Freedland, who needs no introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyway. Jonathan Freedland is a Guardian columnist and the paper's former Washington correspondent. He's the presenter of BBC Radio 4's contemporary history series, The Long View, as well as 2 podcasts, Weekly America for The Guardian and Unholy, alongside the Israeli journalist Yonit Levy. He's a past winner of the Orwell Prize for Journalism and the author of 12 books, the latest being The Escape Artist, the man who broke out of Auschwitz to warn the world. Hailed by the well-known historian Anthony Beevor as an including The Righteous Men, which was the Sunday Times #1 bestseller. Now that's what Jonathan told me I could say, because I always like to ask someone I'm introducing what they want me to say. But I just want to go on and say a little bit more. Our families have known each other for a very, very long time. My parents lived in the East End, and a great aunt of Jonathan's lived just upstairs them. And I think the most personal of Jonathan's books is the one that he wrote entitled Jacob's Gift, A Journey into the Heart of Belonging. And I thoroughly recommend it to any of you here. It's a compelling look into his own fascinating family history through the lives of 3 members of his family, including his late mother, Sarah, whom I remember very, very fondly. And we're really honored that Jonathan is here tonight to talk about his book. Jonathan, over to you.
Thank you, Henry, very much indeed. I'm going to stand up if that's all right. Sheer force of habit. Oh, there we are. Thank you both to Henry and to Sandra for the introduction and for this invitation to be here tonight. It's a very great honor to speak in the name of your late mother and to give a Sabina Miller lecture, given her own extraordinary story, which you just only heard an outline, or even not, a hint of the story there. It's not for me to tell you that story tonight, but there are some very intriguing overlaps between the story I'm going to tell and hers, and maybe we'll bring out that more of that out in question. It is billed as a lecture. Some of you may have been expecting somebody to stand in front of you with a text, reading out loud. I never think there's any point doing that because you could read it yourself. So I'm just going to speak with you, if that's all right. And then we are going to have this conversation afterwards. I just want to say, besides the family connection that binds Henry and me, and I would have said it if you hadn't, Henry, I had heard of you before I met you, because all the people in this world were Mrs., weren't they? It was Mrs. Dove and Mrs. Grunwald, who was so proud of Henry, that I had heard of the reputation of Henry before I had the pleasure of meeting him. But also this synagogue is special for me because I was married under the auspices of Hampstead Synagogue, indeed by Rabbi Michael Harris here. So deep connections, family connections all round. Sandra and I talked about a title for this talk tonight, and we settled on a different path, which I think is the theme of these talks. And in a way, it couldn't be more apposite for the man I'm going to talk about, which is, the man is Rudolf Vrba. Because at each stage of his life, he took a different path, and different from those around him, different from those whose fate was in some ways ordained to be similar to his. He instead reacted differently from others around him. And we will talk about the three periods in a way of his life. The hinge event of his life was being a prisoner in Auschwitz, and the life he had before then was a different path. His response and life inside Auschwitz was different to so many, and then what happened to him afterwards marked him out as different even from other survivors of the Holocaust in ways that are often difficult to talk about, but I hope we can do that tonight. So some of you may have read this book, The Escape Artist. Some of you may have heard me talk about it in other places. Apologies if this is covering old ground, but I'm going to set out the sort of story, and then I think we will have those points of departure to perhaps have questions and conversation about it. The first I knew of this man was an encounter, if you can call it that I had with his figure on a screen, which was when I was 19 years old. I was in the Curzon Mayfair to see part one of an extraordinary 9.5-hour film called Shoah by Claude Lanzmann. So I'm 19 years old and I'm seeing a 9.5-hour documentary about the Holocaust. I now think, pretty weird 19-year-old, now that I'm a father of a teenager, one in his, two sons, one in his early 20s, one who's not yet 19. I think that's a little strange now, but then that's what I was doing. And I was seeing this film, Shoah, which is a really unusual film. Talk about a different path. It's a really different kind of way of telling the documentary story of the Holocaust, mainly because most documentaries tend to use archive footage, black and white photographs from the time. Claude Lanzmann doesn't do any of that. He just has interviews with people who were there. His aim, his intention in the film was to bring the Shoah out of the past and into the present, for his audience to realize this is in our world, it's not in the past. Anyway, for me, sitting there, and this is in the mid-1980s, you don't have to work it out, it means I'm 55. Some of you were going to do the maths, I know. For me there, watching it, it seemed to me this procession of very grey, very old, and candidly very broken people is what it looked like to me. Mainly men, some women, but they seemed as if they were people who had, as indeed they had, been to sort of death and back, that they had seen something so terrible. Until this moment where exploding onto the screen comes this figure utterly unlike everyone else. He is handsome, he has got a thick head of dark hair when the others are sort of grey and hunched. He's speaking English where they spoke Russian or Polish or German. He seems a generation younger than them, which in a way, by the way, he sort of is. He's in New York City when he's being interviewed. The skyline behind him, you can see, includes the Twin Towers, whereas most of the others were interviewed either in Israel or in Eastern Europe. So he is an immediately completely different figure. He's speaking, as I say, in English. He's completely different from all the others and tremendously charismatic as a speaker. And then, almost as an aside, it's mentioned by Landsman in the film that this man had escaped from Auschwitz. And I'm sitting there, age 19, thinking, even though I don't know much, I do know that that is vanishingly rare and almost unheard of for a Jew to escape Auschwitz. And I'm sitting sort of on the edge of my seat thinking, say more about that. That's incredible. How did you do that? But actually, Landsman's not that interested in that. Instead, he asks him about what he saw. Because, I say almost uniquely, I think there may have been one other person who, one or two other people who could have had the same claim. Rudolf Vrba had been in Auschwitz for, first of all, nearly 2 years. I mean, all of you will know that that is, again, exceptionally rare, that the life expectancy of a Jew in Auschwitz was measured in hours. 90 to 95% of the Jews who arrived in Auschwitz were taken to the gas chambers within hours of their arrival. The handful, 5–10% who were selected, famously sent to the right to be a slave and a prisoner, would live for 2 or 3 months. I mean, it was deliberate. It was known as annihilation through labor. It was a Nazi method of killing, to kill people through slave labor. So you weren't meant to survive more than 2 or 3 months maximum, and most of the time hours. And yet he was there for about 20 months. Extremely unusual. And as a slave, worked in all kinds of parts of Auschwitz camp. So he therefore had this really exceptional vantage point. And that's why Claude Landsman wanted to interview him, because he had this sort of panoramic view of Auschwitz, which so few people had. And that's really what he talks about in the film. He doesn't talk much about the escape. Anyway, I'm sitting there age 19, the same age he was when he did this extraordinary deed of escaping. And I did look up, a bit about him, and I read bits about him, and I sort of put it away somewhere in the back of my mind, where it stayed for years and decades. I didn't ever forget about him, by the way. I always knew the name, I knew the outline of the story, but that was sort of it, until around 2016, 2017, when I found myself thinking about it more and more. And that was partly because 2016, as you will remember, was the year that the Oxford English Dictionary anointed the word of the year as post-truth. It was the year of the Brexit referendum in this country and the election of Donald Trump in the United States, and fake news was a phrase, and post-truth was a phrase. And I found myself writing a lot in my day job as a columnist at The Guardian. I was writing a lot about truth and lies and how we had to be vigilant in defense of truth. And I could tell, because when you write a column as long as I've been doing it, you can tell when it's cutting through and when it isn't. And I could tell it wasn't quite connecting, it wasn't landing the importance of truth. And I found myself thinking, well, there needs to be some sort of dramatic way of conveying how important truth is. And I found myself thinking again about Rudolf Vrba, because, as we'll see when I get into it more, the one thing that his life was really about was truth. And he realized, in a way, something that I think it took maybe the pandemic or something for other people to realize, that the difference between truth and lies can be the difference between life and death. And he had been somewhere where that was literally and directly true. And so I found myself going back to his story and decided to tell his story in this book, which is The Escape Artist, which Henry was kind enough to mention. So, who is this man and how did he do it? He's born in provincial Slovakia. His identity, his citizenship was Czechoslovak. That was the country he felt he was a citizen of. But by the time, where our story really begins, Czechoslovakia is already more or less broken up into two, and Slovakia becomes an independent, fascist-run republic. I mean, it isn't occupied by the Germans, but it is super loyal to Hitler's Berlin. And so that starts having a real-world effect on this young man, who by then, at that stage, by the way, isn't called Rudolf Vrba. He's called by the name he was born, which was Walter Rosenberg. Very bright boy, born in the provinces. His father died when he was aged 4. He was brought up by a single mother, a kind of seamstress come businesswoman who specialized in sort of going on the road selling, particularly ladies' underwear. That was her trade. And he was super bright, very, very early on. He had an exceptional ability with languages. He was reading newspapers when he was 2 years old. They thought he's too bright for the regular schooling, and so he ends up in a kind of one of the elite schools in Bratislava until the day, in 1938, he turned up to school and is told, no, there's no place for Jews here anymore. Nuremberg-style laws are in place in Slovakia, except the Slovaks pride themselves that their laws are stricter than the Nuremberg laws. And I found, as part of the research for this book, a front page of a Slovak newspaper with the headline, "No country's restrictions on Jews are stricter than Slovakia's!" exclamation mark. They were proud that they were ahead in the game of persecuting Jews. So he has to leave Bratislava. He ends up in a provincial town of Trnava with his mum. And the kids there are not schooled. They go instead, they sort of roam around. They sit in a park that was known as the pond, a kind of meadow. They educate each other. What little they know, they try and teach each other, the Jewish kids in that town. There's no school for them. There's one textbook which they sort of pass around. And that is life. And each day people would go to the kind of bulletin board, which is on, in the center of town by the village square, where each day a new edict might be pinned up, saying that Jews are not allowed to have sports equipment. That was literally an edict. Or radios, or travel, or owning a business, or whatever. Or literally textbooks. That was one of the ones. All the Jewish kids who've been booted out of school, suddenly the authorities were worried that these Jewish kids might be teaching themselves. So they said, you've got to come in and hand in any books you have, because God forbid Jewish children should learn even alone. So that's life until one day in February 1942, a letter thuds onto the doormat, and it is an instruction to meet at a certain place at a certain time with no more than 25 kilograms of luggage to be deported. And Walter takes one look at this and just thinks, no, I'm not going to do that. No way. I'm born in this country. I speak Slovak. I'm a citizen here. No one is going to put me on a train to God knows where. It was the first time, in a way, that he was to take that different path, because everyone else in his community certainly turned up at the time and at the place and got on that train. And he just refused to do it and began his first escape. He tried to escape. The reason, by the way, I call the book The Escape Artist is because his escape from Auschwitz was not the only one. He was a serial escapologist, constantly trying to escape. So he does escape, and he decides he's going to make his way to London. This is a 17-year-old boy who decides he's going to, incredibly enough, get a cab, get himself to the border with Hungary, cross the border, and so on. And that's how his first escape. It's all in there in the book. Don't worry, I'm going to cut a long story short. He gets caught. He gets sent to a transit camp at Nováky in Slovakia. And again, he decides, when everyone else is sitting around there saying, well, when is this train going to come that's going to deport us from this transit camp of Nováky? He thinks, there's a fence there. There's only one guard. I'm going to try and escape. And again, he escapes. And again, he is caught. And he's sent to Majdanek, which was then a name that no one knew, a place in Poland outside Lublin. And he's there, and he thinks this is terrible, this place, and wooden barracks where people can freeze to death at night, forced labor and so on, head shaved, all body hair shaved, the familiar uniforms that we all know. And he thinks again, I'm going to get out of here. I'm not going to stay here. And so when there is a request for volunteers to come and go somewhere else where they will be asked to work in the open land, he puts his hand up straight away and thinks, yeah, I'm going to volunteer for that, and literally says to a fellow prisoner, a fellow inmate there, nowhere could be worse than this place, so I'm going to volunteer. And he's chosen, and he's delighted. And he's put on a train, and he's sent 36 hours inside one of those fetid, cramped cattle trucks. And then he arrives at a place, and he thinks, yeah, I made the right decision. When he sees this place with brick buildings and paved paths, and a sign above the entrance saying, Arbeit macht frei, he thinks, I definitely made the right decision coming to this place. What's its name again? Auschwitz. He's arrived there on the last day of June 1942, pleased with himself for having got out of Majdanek. And by the way, he was probably right about that, because what happened in Majdanek afterwards would have meant that almost nobody survived. He's there in Auschwitz, and he, like everyone else in Auschwitz, is a slave. He works in different places. I describe it there in the book, physically backbreaking work, until he gets a very lucky break and is sent to the place that is known as Canada. Canada with both a C and a K, depending on what you think the origin of the word is, but the association of this place, it's known as a kind of Aladdin's cave of Auschwitz. This is the place where there is food and drink and clothes, but also fine wine and cognac and jewelry and perfume. Everything can be found in this place. And to the Central European imagination of the mid-century, the place where the streets were paved with gold, where there were a land of unimaginable plenty, was Canada, the country, Canada. Lots of Slovaks and Czechs and Romanians had emigrated to Canada and said, it's amazing here. And so therefore, the place in Auschwitz where there was all this plenty was known as Canada. His job is to sort through these, transport bags, suitcases that arrive, and at great speed move them between these 6 warehouses, which are arranged around a kind of courtyard, giant warehouses, where there are piles of, and when I say piles, like mountains of blankets or pots and pans and men's clothes and women's clothes and children's clothes. And his job is taking these suitcases, and emptying out the contents where a pack of sort of sorters would descend and immediately put blankets there, clothes there, pots there, pans there. Later, he would admit that with some embarrassment that he did not understand straight away what he was looking at in Canada. It took him a while for the penny to drop. He was just concerned at that point with surviving the beatings of the capos who would beat the workers to be moving at double time, to grab a hunk of bread if he could get one without getting another beating. That's all he was focused on. And later on, he would say that he had only had at first vague suspicions of where he was. The penny eventually did drop because he realized there's a pile of men's clothes, there's a pile of women's clothes, and there's a pile of children's clothes, but I look around this camp and there are no children. So, and there's more clothes here than there are prisoners. There are clothes worn by old people, and yet there are no old people here. And slowly, the penny drops that this is a place unlike any that has ever existed in human history, that he understands from vague suspicions to eventually understanding takes weeks. He realizes he's in a place without precedent, a center for the industrialized killing of human beings, a death factory. Nothing like it has ever existed before, which is why it took him a while to realize what he's looking at. And then the proof of that then comes where with his job is moved from just taking these bags and into the sorting area to unloading the bags as soon as they arrive. Namely, he is transferred to the Alte Judenrampe, the old Jew ramp, as the SS called it, which is literally the platform, the railway platform, where each of these trains, these transports would arrive, sometimes at a rate of 5 a day, often in the dead of night. And there were a group of people, a detail that he was part of, who would have to get onto the train, and the first thing they would do before they got the people off was to get the bags off. One of his big observations was that this was a commercial enterprise. The stuff, the pots, the pans, the clothes, the cognac was not incidental. It was a really big objective of the camp to get as much of this wealth off these people and sorted as quickly as possible. There were people whose jobs were to just run their fingers along the hem of the clothes, the trousers, the skirts, to see if there was a jewel, a diamond that had been sewn into the hem. He sees on the first day of Canada, he never doesn't understand it for weeks, a group of women who are sitting on a bench with zinc buckets on either side of them, going through tubes of toothpaste, squeezing them out in case, as sometimes happened, a roll of dollar bills had been secreted inside, or indeed a precious jewel, a ring, a wedding ring, things that people had brought as insurance policies, perhaps as bribes. They would be found and they would be put in those zinc buckets and so on. Now he sees, at first he'd just seen the possessions, now he's actually taken these cases off these people. And straight afterwards, he and the other rolling commando, they were called, have to stand aside after they've got all the bags. That's the priority. Then the people, most of them alive, some dead or dying in the cattle cars, people who couldn't survive the journey. They have to get them off as well at double time, double speed, beatings if you didn't do it. He then watches every night, sometimes 5 times a night, the selection. Some to the left, healthy people, younger people to the right, to be prisoners. And he witnesses that day after day. And I write in the book that the first work he had done was work to break the back. This was work that would break your heart, to see these families divided night after night. Fathers this way, sons that way, mothers this way, daughters that way. But he sees this night after night. And friends of his begin to worry that he is cracking up under the strain of what he's witnessing, that he's only just 18 years old, that he's having some kind of breakdown, witnessing these tragedies hour by hour, night after night, until this moment of realization, which hits him with great clarity. And it's extraordinary because other people, perhaps older people, had been there, hadn't seen it with the clarity he saw it, which is, it dawns on him that what he's seeing every night reveals to him what the Nazis' secret weapon is. Because he understands that the core ingredient in the method that is being played out night after night is deception. That the Nazis have deceived their victims at every possible stage. And that means the people getting off those trains, and Rudy in later life would say he never met a single arrival at Auschwitz who had any idea where they'd come or what the purpose of the place they had come to was. That these people getting off the trains had no idea where they were. If anything, they had an idea, which was, this is the place where we're going to begin our new lives. We've been deported to the east to begin new lives in new Jewish communities where we are going to be able to start all over again. That's why they had brought the pots and the pans and the blankets and the children's toys and the children's exercise books and the child's atlas, which was one of the things that Walter had found when he worked in Canada. That's why they brought the diamond in the hem. They thought this would be something we can sell to start our new life. He realizes that's why they get off the trains the way they get off, and that's why they organize themselves into columns when they're told to be, they're not organizing themselves, when they're told to be organized into columns, that's why they obey. Neat lines of men and women and ready to be sent to the left, to the right. They have no idea. And this is the key insight he comes to. The entire method of Nazi slaughter of the Jews depends on a lie. It depends on the deception. Now, when I myself knew, for example, I'm guessing like a lot of people in this room, we grew up with the stories of the Holocaust, and probably we knew even years and years ago about, for example, the fact that they were told when they went into gas chambers they were going to have a shower, and that there was a shower head in the ceiling out of which no water ever came. I knew that and didn't really think about it very much. I thought it was sort of, if I did think about it, I thought perhaps it was like some macabre, sick joke by the SS to tell people you're being bathed or something. It was absolutely central to the method. It wasn't an added extra. Walter realizes that. And so it comes to this moment of thinking, if there is to be any chance of halting this killing machine, the deception has to end. This veil, it has to end. This veil of ignorance behind which the Jews of Europe are held has to be torn down. And at that point, he realizes somebody has to escape from this place and warn the Jews of Europe what they clearly don't know, which is what fate awaits them. And if that happens, he says to himself, he's not naive, even though he's only 18 years old. He doesn't think the Jews of Europe will then rise up and launch some armed revolt or armed resistance. He's seen the people arriving. They're old, they're frail, they're children. They have no weapons. Of course not. But what he does think is maybe they will panic. If the Jews of Europe getting off those trains know they're about to be killed, the least they might do is panic. And if they panic and stampede, say, and there's chaos, that at least might slow things down. It might throw sand in the gears of the Nazi killing machine. That's the most he hopes for. And in this quite chilling line, he said it to Claude Lanzmann, I don't think it's in the film though. He says he understands that for the Nazis, it is much easier to kill sheep than to hunt deer. This is a boy who'd been in the Slovak countryside, right? Sheep you can organize into a column that you can go through into the abattoir. Hunting deer, with a gun, a rifle, picking one off after another on a mountainside is slow. You'll miss some will get away. It's hard. That's what he thought. The Jews need to become deer, not sheep. And to become deer, you have to know what fate awaits you at the end of the railway line. He resolves that he will escape and warn the world. Incredible. It's a sort of arrogance of youth. I find it incredibly inspiring. An 18-year-old decides, somebody has to do it, it might as well be me. He then has to have an escape partner. He teams up with somebody who's from his own hometown of Turnover. I think, by the way, that's crucial. Fred Wetzler was also from Turnover. I think in the world of Auschwitz, where up was down and black was white and day was night, you had no way of knowing who you could trust unless you knew them before. And you knew that they were trustworthy from before. So the two of them team up and plan an escape. I'm not going to tell you how they escape, because I want some of you to read the book. But suffice it to say, as perhaps quite a lot of gender stereotype, men my age, I really lapped up a lot of Second World War escape stories and the movies and all that, and I'm telling you, this is the best escape story there is from the Second World War. Bar none. I mean, obviously I'm biased, but it is so ingenious and so thrilling. How they did it, it is, like one of the greatest adventure stories. This, by the way, is the first touching point with Sabina's story, because a crucial part of this game, I'm not going to say why, did involve hiding in a hole in the ground. And I know that that was part of Sabina's story too, in a different context. I'm not going to, as I said, I'm not going to tell you the details. Suffice it to say, somehow, even though essentially nobody had ever engineered their own escape before, the day before Fred and Rudy did it, there was a Jewish prisoner who got out called Siegfried Lederer. He was taken out by an SS man. It's an amazing story. I tell it in the book, but it's not the same as making your own escape. As far as I'm concerned, Fred and Rudy are the first to do it that way, and they somehow get out. That's not the end of the adventure by any means at all, because they are suddenly in Nazi-occupied Poland, which to be two Jews on the run in Nazi-occupied Poland is, as hard an ordeal it's on a par with escaping from Auschwitz. As Rudy would later say, he comes out of Auschwitz with no map, no compass, no friends. Very important. If you were a Polish prisoner, political prisoner in Auschwitz, and you got out, there was the Polish resistance on the outside, there to meet you and help you. And that there are many dozens of those. If you're a Soviet prisoner of war and you get out, there are people ready to help you. There are networks, etc. A Jew in Poland, there was nobody to help. And so for 11 days, Fred and Walter, as he still was, crossed mountains and marshland and forests and rivers in ice and in rain. They come under fire from German bullets at one point. It is, again, I would say, biased, but an amazing adventure how they managed to do it, but somehow they do. And they get themselves to their home country of Slovakia. There they make contact with the remnant Jewish community of Slovakia, tiny Jewish community left, a few thousand who have held on. It's a whole story how that happened, which I can tell you if you want to know about it when we do questions. But they're there, and in a basement room in the Jewish old people's home in Žilina, a provincial town in Slovakia, I've stood in that room, that words pour out of them. Fred and Rudy testify to what they've seen. How were they able to do this in tremendous and precise detail? Because Rudy, as well as being an extraordinary sort of, physically brave person who was ingenious enough to plan this escape, he also was gifted with a phenomenal memory. I toyed with calling the book The Memory Man, because what he did at that point when he realized, standing on that railway platform, that somebody has to tell the world, was he then set about memorizing every transport that came in to Auschwitz, by its point of origin, the number of cattle cars per train, and an estimated number of people per cattle car. And the way he remembered each one was by the numbers of the handful of people on each transport who was picked out and selected to work as slaves in the camp, who were then, of course, given a serial number, the number that famously was on their uniform, and, of course, even more notoriously tattooed on the arms of those prisoners. Those numbers were not random. They corresponded to a specific transport. And Rudy made it his business to memorize every number and every transport. He said he did it like a child's memory game. I went to market and I had a tomato, an orange, and a basket. Yesterday I went to market with a tomato, an orange, a basket, and a book. That's how he did it. Each day he added on the new transports onto all the other hundreds he'd memorized. And so there in that basement room in Žilina, he pours out all this data to the people taking it down, the lawyers, engineers who are writing it down as fast as they can. And the result is a 32-page report, which single-spaced, which then has to embark on its own escape journey, passed hand to hand secretly across borders, smuggled into Hungary, into across occupied Europe. Again, an amazing story. I think my book is the first place anywhere that story has been reconstructed, involving secret Catholic resistance translators hiding in attic rooms, translating at nights, avoiding the German occupiers so that nobody should see the words on the page, because if they did, it would reveal everything. That report makes its way to London, to Washington, and to Rome, and incredibly, given that it's the word of an 18-year-old boy and his escape partner, Fred Wetzler, the word reaches the desk of Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, Pope Pius himself. And again, in the book, there are these, I recount the responses of people in those different capitals. By then, by the way, the report has literally paper-clipped on top an appeal from the Jewish leaders of the world, Chaim Weizmann, Moshe Chertok, later Moshe Sharet, from the Jewish Agency in Jerusalem, attach an appeal to the report saying, here's the evidence that something unique in human history exists, a mass killing center. We urge you to bomb the railway tracks to this place called Auschwitz. If Auschwitz is a factory of death, take out the conveyor belt. Bomb the railway tracks. This appeal makes its way to Churchill. Churchill instructs his deputy, foreign minister, or rather his foreign secretary, Anthony Eden, get anything out of the Air Force you can, invoke my name if necessary. Martin Gilbert, great historian of the period and Churchill's official biographer, says later that this is the most direct order he ever saw Churchill give. That minute is in response to the Vrba Wetzler report. He reads it and says, get anything out of the Air Ministry you can. Eden goes to the head of the Air Force. Head of the Air Force says, no. We bomb at night. This would have to be done by day. Go and talk to the Americans. The report is then sent over by a different route. It reaches the Americans. It goes to one department, then another department. This seems more in your line of work. A bureaucrat, right, passes it to someone else. And it goes bouncing around from place to place. Meanwhile, at this point, at exactly this point, and this was the reason, by the way, that Fred and Rudy knew there was urgency about getting this report out. Meanwhile, the Holocaust, the Nazi attempt to eradicate the Jews of Europe, has stretched to the last community of Europe that had not yet been pulled into the inferno, namely the Jews of Hungary. And in that period, Fred and Rudy escaped on April the 7th is when they began their escape, 1944. By the way, they didn't know this, it was the Seder night, the first night of their escape from slavery to freedom. It was the first night of Pesach. They didn't know. Fred Rudy himself would not know that until 50 years later when someone showed him the calendar. He had no idea. In that period, they knew that the Jews of Hungary were next, and sure enough, in May and in June of 1944, the Nazi killing at Auschwitz accelerated so it reached its most intense pitch. This is the era of the D-Day landings, right? People were thinking the war is wrapping up, it's nearly over. Not so for the Nazi war on the Jews, which was reaching a level of intensity to the point where 12 to 15,000 Jews were arriving in Auschwitz every day from Hungary and being murdered. And yet, at the same time, somebody in Washington is writing, I wonder if we should have a meeting about this. Let's send it by post to someone else. 3 days goes by. Yes, I'm not sure about this. What do you think? 2 more days go by. People are dying every single day. And in the end, as we all know famously, the decision is taken not to bomb the railway tracks. The response that goes back to the Jewish leaders is, the best thing we can do for you is to win the war. Anything which diverts from the war effort is not to be encouraged. We're not going to do it. And so it doesn't happen. It's partly, we'll get into this later if we want to, it's partly practical, this thing about bombing day, bombing night. It's also partly prejudice. I have in the book a memo from a Foreign Office official saying, I think we have to allow for a certain degree of Jewish exaggeration with these reports. And, famously another document talks about these wailing Jews who've, we've done far too much for these people already. So it runs into prejudice, similar in Washington, by the way. It's not just here. It runs into practicality, it runs into prejudice. But here's where I want to close the last stage of this. It also runs into disbelief, incredulity. People read this report, and in some ways they cannot believe it. Remember, what was the motive for Rudy when he stood on that railway line and thought somebody has to escape? That railway platform, he thought somebody has to escape and tell the world. His motive was that the Jews arriving from all points in Europe should not be in ignorance. That was his motive. He wanted them to know, right? And he particularly wanted the Jews of Hungary to know. So he would have been delighted to know that his report reached the Jewish leadership in Hungary more or less the day it was finished. The ink was still wet when a copy is handed in person to the de facto leader of Hungarian Jewry, a man known by the name of Rezső Kastner. Important name. Kastner takes it to the Jewish leadership in Hungary. They have a meeting, and the president of the community leadership, Samu Stern, says, how do we know this isn't the product of the feverish imagination of 2 rash young men? How can we believe it? We can't believe it. Kastner himself decides not to pass on the report to the Jews of Hungary. He sees this warning, and for reasons which are deep, complicated, and massively contested to this day, He does not pass on that warning. We can talk about that too if you want to. And so the report stays literally in a desk drawer in Budapest, while the Jews of Hungary are sent on trains every single day, until by the end of June, early July, 437,000 Jews of Hungary, from the provinces mainly, have been deported to their deaths. Partly because people just couldn't believe what they were reading. The key point, though, we should say, because it's important for the overall context, is despite all of that, this is not a story of a failure, because the Jews of Budapest were still alive. 200,000 of them were still alive, had not been deported. They were about to be deported, they were next. But the report, written by Fred and Rudy in that basement, has worked its own way through multiple routes, people smuggling, etc. And thankfully, and I say this with, yes, some professional bias, but when you read the story, I think you will feel the same thing. With great relief, it finally found its way into the hands of a journalist. And it found its way into the hands of a British journalist. Walter Garrett of the Exchange Telegraph Press Agency sits in Zurich, gets this report, and realizes this is the story of the century. And he, at last, publishes it. And when it's published, and word now is spreads in all the newspapers of Europe that are not censored, I mean, it's in Britain and it's in Switzerland, then those world leaders, who, by the way, have known about this for a while, because they had the report earlier, now their publics are saying, there's this terrible place in Europe called Auschwitz. We don't even know how to pronounce the word, but apparently they're killing people in industrial fashion. What are you going to do? And then, only then, despite pleas to act sooner, Franklin Roosevelt sends a message to the leader of Hungary, and so does the Pope. They both send messages saying, the Pope can't bring himself to use the word Jews. He said, these unfortunate souls, please stop deporting them. And Roosevelt says, if we win the war, I should warn you that anyone who is seen as complicit in deporting Jews to this mysterious place in the East called Auschwitz will be held accountable for what are not yet called war crimes. That suddenly, the leader of Hungary, Miklos Horthy, who has sat by fully aware that 437,000 Jews in Hungary have been deported to their deaths, now he orders a halt to the deportations. On July the 6th, the trains finally stop. In one case, a train that was literally on its way to Auschwitz turns around and goes back to Budapest. Every Jew on that train, every Jew among those 200,000 was spared from murder in Auschwitz as a consequence of the report written by Rudolf Vrba and Fred Wetzler, which is why I say both of them are towering figures of the Holocaust period, and why Rudy's story, because he's the one we're focusing on tonight, in my mind, deserves to be placed alongside Anne Frank, Oskar Schindler, Primo Levi, as one of the stories that define our understanding of the Shoah. It is not the case that it is seen that way, and that also is a story because of the different path he would then take after the war. And we can talk about that too, why he's not as famous as I argue he should be. But at each stage, he took a different path. In Slovakia, when people were told to turn up at a certain time in a certain place for deportation, he said, no, I'm not going to do that, I'm going to escape. Inside Auschwitz, he was, I only use this word because he used it, he was lucky through a series of lucky breaks to survive and get himself into a position where he could see what was going on and he had the wherewithal to attempt an escape. He took a different path. Nobody had done what he was about to do ever before. And finally, after the war, he was a very different kind of Holocaust survivor. And because I'm aware I've been talking so long, I'll save that for when we get on to questions. But at each stage, he took a different path. I think the world owes him, the Jewish world certainly owes him a great debt. I think those 200,000, in the end, by the way, it was fewer because there were more. A new regime took over in Hungary and they killed tens of thousands of Jews of Budapest. But the tens of thousands short of 200,000, but not far short, of Jews owed their lives to him, and so do their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. There may be as many as 1 million people alive in the world today who owe their lives to what these two people did. And I would say the wider world owes him this huge debt, because he understood something which is true now, even if we can't see it, which is that the difference between the truth and lies can be the difference between life and death. It was in Auschwitz, and I think even in our own world, it remains that way today. As I say, I think he deserves to be recognized as one of the towering figures of this period. And by being here today, as we build up to Holocaust Memorial Day, and listening and remembering his story, I think collectively we have done something to honor his memory. Thank you very much. Wow. Thank you.
So I'm going to take questions not only from the floor here, but also from those who are watching online. And I've had a number in. I've not been playing with my phone. There are various messages coming in. And the first question comes from Gabriel Herman. And it refers to what you said, Jonathan, about post-truth. Was there post-truth during World War II? The Jewish Chronicle's reporting of the Holocaust was remarkably accurate. The rest of the British press coverage was muted. But is that because people can't cope psychologically with impalpable truths?
Well, thank you, Gabriel, for the question. Is that an online question?
It's an online question.
Yeah, but thank you very much for that question. I think it's a very good question. And the answer is concisely yes. I mean, worse than post-truth, lies were present in the Holocaust from the beginning. And the way I sometimes think of it is, when did Holocaust denial begin? We often think of this as a post-war phenomenon, Holocaust denial. Holocaust denial begins with the Holocaust. I mean, the Holocaust was denied as it was happening. And in fact, it was central to the Holocaust being possible that it be denied from the very start, for the reasons I said, that the victims had to be ignorant of their fate. And so the Nazis went to enormous lengths to deny what they were doing, elaborate, complicated lengths. I mean, they would get their victims to write postcards under duress, at gunpoint, on pain of death, to their families back home, saying, it's lovely here, with this new life, we can't wait for you to come to this new community. Make sure you bring enough toys for the children, it's wonderful. Jews under duress, forced to send these messages, by the way, would try and smuggle out some clues that these messages were under duress and that they were not being treated well. So they would send messages like, it's wonderful to hear you must come. Every day we eat as if it was Yom Kippur. They would, messages like that. They would then say, anyway, we must go. Do send our love to Mother. And the recipient would think, our mother died 5 years ago. Why are they saying that? They were trying to say something's not right here. But it's very hard to do that when you have the biggest superpower in Europe devoting its huge industrial might to your destruction and to pursuing this lie. So it absolutely was there from the beginning. And yet, and I think some people will have seen this new Ken Burns documentary and so on about American knowledge. If you were looking for it, it was there in black and white. I mean, there was a minute silence in the House of Commons in December 1942, led by Anthony Eden, for saying that we do believe there is mass murder of Jews going on in Europe. And this was presented to the then embryonic United Nations in 1942. Now, what Fred and Rudy did was peculiar because they broke to the world, they revealed to the world the truth of Auschwitz. Auschwitz specifically was not known. That was mysterious. There's argument among historians about maybe people at the highest level, government level, had intelligence reports. But certainly in terms of world opinion, nobody knew. So that is what Fred and Rudy were getting out to the world. But otherwise, the clues were there. And let's face it, the Hitler and the Nazis never hid their intentions. The quotes from Adolf Hitler saying, we will annihilate the Jews of Europe, they go back early into the 30s and even by some measure into the 20s. The beer hall putsch, he's already then saying that their project is one aimed at elimination of the Jews, but they were denying it at the time. So post-truth is a massive understatement. The whole project was built on lies from the very, very beginning.
Questions in the room, and if you can put a hand up, because we have a microphone. Gerard, take you in a moment. Max, you're closer. Take you in a moment.
Yes, just a couple of things. I mean, Vrba wasn't the first one. I mean, what about the story of Jan Karski, who went into the ghetto, came out again, a non-Jewish Pole, who on purpose reported and nothing was done, and he wasn't believed, and he suffered for the rest of his lives there. And there were other stories about people coming out of Treblinka and telling people in Warsaw Ghetto what happened, and they weren't believed. So it wasn't just unique to that, but the general trend was not to believe. And yeah, well...
Shall I answer that one?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you're quite right about, you said wasn't the first. Rudolf, Vrba and Fred Wetzel are the first from Auschwitz. Jan Karski had not been to Auschwitz. He had, as you say, he'd been to a concentration camp and to the Warsaw Ghetto. And I discuss Karski in the book, and I'm glad you mentioned him because it gives me a chance to say something in response as well to the previous question about this point of disbelief. This really is the point that I want people to take away from the book, certainly from telling the story. There's a great moment where Jan Karski goes to Washington and he meets Roosevelt himself. He met Anthony Eden in London, but he meets Roosevelt himself. He also met Felix Frankfurter, the Jewish judge on the Supreme Court. And he tells his evidence of persecution and mass murder of Jews. And Frankfurter listens to him and at the end says, "I don't believe you." And immediately the man who's brought Karski leaps to his feet and says, "This man has all the credentials, he's a trustworthy man." He was this kind of Polish aristocrat, Karski. The courier, he was known as, he wrote. And he begins to defend the credentials of Jan Karski. And Frankfurter puts his hands up and says, "No, I didn't say he's not telling the truth. I said I didn't believe him. They're different things." What he meant was he could not believe him. And I quote in the book Raymond Aron, the French Jewish philosopher, who says, he said it to Claude Lanzmann actually, or Lanzmann quotes it in the film. "I knew, but I did not believe. And because I did not believe, I did not know." To me, the most arresting stories in the book come towards the end where people were directly told, not just via a report, directly told what Auschwitz meant and could not absorb what they were hearing. It was too painful to believe. The example I have in mind is 2 weeks after Fred and Rudy escaped, the same method they had used was used by 2 other prisoners, Mordovich and Rosen. They escaped the same way, and actually for the same purpose, to update the reports they hoped Fred and Rudy had got out. Their plan was to update, and they did. And so the Auschwitz reports, plural, include Mordovich and Rosen who escaped after. 6 weeks later, to say the rumors that Fred and Rudy had heard about the Jews of Hungary are true, we are actually seeing it, 12 to 15,000 a day. By an incredible and very bleak twist of fate, Mordovich was recaptured and put back on a train back to Auschwitz. This is a man who's escaped Auschwitz. On the train, he says to his fellow Jews, "Listen, I've been to this place where they're taking us. They tattooed this number on my arm. They will kill us as soon as we arrive. There are gas chambers, there are crematoria. We need to jump off this train because we are all going to a certain death." The people on that train, in that cattle truck, not only did not believe Czeslaw Mordovich, they started violently beating him for saying what he was saying. And they summoned the German guards to say, "You must take off this man, he's saying the most terrible things." And so Mordovich went back to Auschwitz on that train. And incredibly, he actually survived. But the other people on the train did not. They were warned directly. That's the most direct warning you can have. They could not believe it. And here I remember, even when I was younger than 19, I had a conversation with the late, much mourned, beloved Rabbi Hugo Green, who said, when asked this question, Auschwitz survivor, crucially, Why is it that people didn't? He said, never underestimate human beings' ability to deceive themselves, especially when it comes to matters of their own debt. People can't, there's only so much people can take. And people, including that man in Hungary and Budapest, confronted with the report, what do you say? That they didn't want to believe it, or they on some level could not believe it, but they could not believe it. And this was the thing that Rudy had never really planned for. That information is not enough. That information has to be believed. And we see this in our own world now, where there's, existential threats are pointed out with the climate and so on. We have the facts. Nobody can say we don't have the information. But there's something separate, which is believing it. And it's very hard to believe it when it comes to matters of your own debt.
Jonathan, can you bring the microphone to Jerry here? And if you keep your hands up, I'll make sure you all get an opportunity.
Thank you. Masterclass presentation.
Thank you.
It makes me feel far more committed to commemorate Holocaust Memorial Day later this week. It's a privilege to sit next to Olivia, and I hope she's given an opportunity to mention the candle thing a little later on today. Just two very quick issues. The leader of the Hungarian community that you mentioned, who declined to pass on the warning. What motivated him to take that decision? And second of all, why isn't the hero of the book known? Why has he been hidden for so long? Why hasn't the community, worldwide community, lauded him as he obviously deserves to be?
Thank you.
And what happened to him?
Great questions, both. Thank you very much. So Kastner and his failure to pass it on. Kastner was engaged in negotiations at the time with the man who was the architect of the final solution in general, but was then literally in Budapest, namely Adolf Eichmann. Now, at this point, what your version of the story depends on which camp as in school of thought, you adopt. Because Kastner has defenders who say he was sincerely trying to negotiate a deal with the Nazis that would have saved the Jews of Hungary. That's the pro-Kastner reading. The anti-Kastner reading is that by then it was absolutely obvious that Eichmann was not going to do any such deal, and instead had done a side deal with Kastner which said, if you keep quiet, I will allow you to take 1,700 hand-picked friends of yours and relatives on a train to freedom. But the price is you must not breathe a word of what we are doing with all the other Jews of Hungary. And the so-called Kastner train is a real thing, 1,684 people. They were family of Kastner, they were from his hometown of Cluj, they were notables, the Satmar Rebbe was one of them, they had to pay at least $1,000 each, I think it was, yes, it would have been $1,000. This is argued to this day. So there is a book called Kastner, Hero of the Thing, which was written a few years ago, a Jewish hero, and equally there is the other view which says that he was a collaborator with the Nazis. It is the most contested subject. To this day, you'll know that Kastner's granddaughter is Merav Michaeli, the leader of the Israeli Labour Party. It is argued about still. Rudy's view was damning of Kastner. He took the most hardline view, and, we don't have enough time, but I'm pretty sympathetic to Rudy's view. I think the evidence is so overwhelming against Kastner. But I do want to acknowledge there is another view, and some people take their other position. There's a very good historian called Paul Bogdanor. People may know of his father, Vernon Bogdanor. Paul Bogdanor embarked on a book on the life of Kastner with a very clear determination. He was determined to exonerate Kastner. He wanted to clear this up because, as many of you know, anti-Zionists made big play of Kastner. The play Perdition that was going to be on at the Royal Court in 1987 was about the Kastner story, and they like to say, here's this horrible man who collaborated with the Nazis. He was a Zionist, therefore that tells you what Zionism is. So Bogdanor set out to clear Kastner's name. By the time he looked at the documents, he said, and I spoke to him for my book, it's worse than you think. He actually goes further and says, which is shocking, he says that Kastner was not just a collaborator, he was literally a Nazi agent. It's the word he uses. And the damning bit of the last bit on this, the thing that tips me into that camp, that view, is that 2 or 3 eminent Nazis in Budapest, people who were part of the occupying force, were not prosecuted fully at Nuremberg. Why? Because letters vouching for their character were sent to the Nuremberg tribunal by Rudolf Kastner, Raju Kastner. That was after the war, when there was no longer a gun to his head. He spoke up for Becher, Krumi, a third Nazi. I think that can only be explained by somebody who feared, who needed their silence about him. So that's, Kastner is a side story. Rudi Vrba wrote a memoir, it was called I Cannot Forgive. I interviewed Rudi's first wife, not far from here. She was 93 years old. It was in the summer of 2020 during COVID. We sat in her garden and she says, Rudi's book is called I Cannot Forgive. Everyone always assumed he meant, the end of the sentence was, I cannot forgive Hitler, I cannot forgive the Nazis. Yes, she said, but also I cannot forgive Kastner, is who he meant. She felt by that because he had failed to pass on his warning and he felt that was, Rudi felt that was indefensible morally. So that's the Kastner story. As I say, different sides, people will take different views. Your other question, very good question, is related, which is why is Rudi's story not better known? In a way, what I've just talked about is part of the reason. Because Rudi insisted on talking about this, and this people didn't want to hear. He did not stand in front of all Jewish audiences and say, here's my Holocaust story, and in the Holocaust story there are the evil villains, which are the Nazis, and everybody else is good. Churchill and the Air Force and Roosevelt and the Jewish leadership in Hungary, we're all good, and all the evil in the story is on that side. No, he did not tell that story. Instead, he told a much more painful and difficult story where people did not act. They failed to pass on his report or they failed to act on his report. And that's what he would talk about. And so even in Vancouver, which is where he spent the last 30 years of his life, in answer to your question about what happened to him, he became a biochemist in post-war Czechoslovakia. He escaped again from communist Czechoslovakia. He couldn't bear being unfree, and so he did an amazing Cold War, John le Carré style escape from Czechoslovakia. He was the escape artist, and he came first to Israel, he then went to England, 7 years in England because his wife had gone there with their daughters, and then he ends in Canada as an associate professor, he never was made full professor, of biochemistry in Vancouver. And there in Vancouver, which has not got an enormous Jewish community, every year they would organize, for Holocaust Memorial Day probably, a symposium for high school students where there would be a panel of 3 or 4 Holocaust survivors. Do you think they invited Rudolf Vrba? They did not. Even in Vancouver, he was not invited to the Vancouver Jewish Community Holocaust commemoration. I interviewed the man who organized that event, and I said to him, you had the ultimate witness in your community there, and you didn't invite him. And he said you couldn't invite him because you didn't know whether or not he would descend into, his words, accusations and rage. He would stand there pointing the finger, accusing all the people who hadn't done enough, including, and very often to Jewish audiences, he would talk about Jewish leaders and how they had failed to do enough. When he was in Germany, he would talk about Nazis and how the evil was on them. But to Jewish audiences, he would say, Kastner and this one and that one had not done enough. And it became uncomfortable to invite him. And this is what I mean about a different path, because I found in the archives a letter he'd written to a BBC TV producer who had asked him to appear in a documentary. And he said, I must warn you, I am not your cliched survivor. I won't be the cliched Holocaust survivor. What did he mean? He wouldn't do what I think we demand of Holocaust survivors. There are only so few now still alive, but I think we expect them to say, to give us some kind of, to console us, actually, to offer some consoling, healing wisdom and to tell us that in the end people are good, and you know, I've seen the worst there is, and still I cherish every day of life. There's a very successful book by a Holocaust survivor called The Happiest Man in the World. You know, that's what people want from Holocaust survivors. They don't want the angriest man in the world. And in a way, Rudolf Vrba was the angriest man in the world because he believed he had done everything humanly possible, and frankly, things that weren't humanly possible, to get himself out and to memorize every detail and to put it in a report that did reach the Jewish leaders and world leaders, and still it wasn't enough. And that anger never left him. And the result was that people who were the gatekeepers of memory in a way, for example, Yad Vashem, you know, they sort of wrote Fred and Rudy out of the story. I think it may have changed now. I don't want to claim any credit for it, but until recently, the Vrba Wetzler report, their report was not filed in Yad Vashem under their names. It didn't mention their names. It said 2 Slovak escapees, 2 young men, 2 Slovak. It wrote the names out. They had done the most heroic thing possible. And yet in the Jewish narrative, they sort of had gone. I think now, 80 years on, those fights are sort of over about Kastner and this and that. And now we're ready to honor him. But in his own lifetime, he was not honored. When he died, he was buried. There was not a minyan at his funeral. There was a memorial service in Vancouver afterwards. There were fewer people at that memorial than there are in this room. So he was written out of the story. And that was why you can see why I'm very passionate about this, because I'm determined to do what I can. It's not much, but to do what I can to give him his place in the story.
Well, you've written him back into history in a big way. It is an absolutely fantastic book. Jonathan, can you take the microphone to the gentleman here? And just while you're doing that, some of the questions that have come in online have been answered, but here's maybe a simple one. I don't know. It's a very personal one. Adrian Banks wants to know, you mentioned his mother. What happened to Rudolf's mother?
It's an amazing thing. She was deported to Theresienstadt, but she too survived. And she lived till she was 96 years old. She stayed in Slovakia. I don't know if people have asked this, but I should do it in fairness and out of respect for his memory. Fred Wetzler survived and stayed in Slovakia. People often ask, why have you not written his story? And as well, and the simple truth is, because he stayed in Slovakia, he died in 1987, when it was still communist Czechoslovakia. He was not able to tell his own story. It's a side point, it's in my book, but incredibly, talk about Holocaust denial, Jews were not allowed to talk about the Jewish character of the Holocaust in Czechoslovakia. Instead, it was anti-fascists who had been persecuted, not specifically Jews, and therefore, Fred Wetzler wrote his story. He had to disguise it as a novel. He wrote it under the name that he'd been given when Fred and Rudy were given false papers. Remember, in the basement in Žilina, they were on the run. The Nazis had a warrant out for their lives, right? They were Walter Rosenberg and Alfred Wetzler. They were given new names. Fred Wetzler was given the name Josef Lanik, which he used as a pseudonym when he wrote this novel based on what had happened. And Walter Rosenberg was given the pseudonym Rudolf Vrba, which he liked and he kept with for his life. Wetzler dropped that name and would live in Czechoslovakia. And therefore, he was never able to tell his story properly. I mean, there are bits and pieces, fragments. Whereas Rudy spoke to Claude Lanzmann, he was a witness in war crimes trials. For me doing the book, it was possible because there are thousands of pages of transcripts that I could use. Whereas with Fred, I really hope a Slovak writer will somehow tell the story of Fred Wetzler, but that wasn't, that wasn't my place to do that. But does that answer the question? I hope it does.
Sir.
My name is Botkaj.
Into the microphone, please.
My name is Botkaj, and I happen to be a Hungarian escapee. And I just want to underline what people knew. In 1941 or thereabout, our family had a meeting where my father came and said, whatever happens, you mustn't be going with the stream. So that there were people who knew. They probably didn't know the details, but they knew that there was something horrible is happening. So that is just to underline nor do I believe that if 1,700 people go on the train, that there aren't twice as many people who knew that they were going to escape. That will also have spread the news of whatever, not the details, not the gas chambers, but something horrible. And that's what put my parents to buy false identity papers at the time. So the other point I just wanted to make, that Kessler was shot in Jerusalem some years
Kastner.
after.
Kastner, yeah.
Thank you, sir. There's the hand at the back. The gentleman at the back had a question. It's been answered. Other hands, please. Yes, there's a gentleman over there. And in fact, there's someone closer.
This has been all male, hasn't it?
See the hand.
That was why I felt compelled to ask a question.
Can't have an all-male gathering.
It's just, I mean, there's so much I want to discuss with you, but we can talk later. But a very practical, specific question: where are you up to in terms of the movie? Because this needs to be a film as well.
Thank you.
Broaden the audience.
Yeah. Thank you.
And I've got ideas.
The funny thing is, this is the 12th book I've now written, as Henry was kind enough to mention, and people have often said that to me about films, as if I was somehow choosing not to have my books turned into films. I would always love that to happen. No, I'm glad to say, with this book, unlike all the other books, there are several groups of people who want to make a film of this, and they actually want to make a series, like a limited series, because there's too much that happens in this life to cram it into a film, actually. I think it's true. You couldn't really tell this in an hour and a half, I mean, I struggled to do it this evening. So I think there is appetite to do it, and I think, who knows, I've always said about this, that I won't believe it's a film until I'm literally sitting in a cinema seeing the final credits, or, and even then I'll wonder, because there's so many things that can go wrong. But it would be very nice if it happened. For the moment, there is the book, and there's the audio book, and you just hope that gets it out to some people. But thank you for asking.
There's a hand up over there for a while. I'll come to you. How much time do we have? It's okay to go long. Another 5 minutes. Okay.
Thank you for an amazing lecture. You mentioned elsewhere Vrba's paranoia, and at least that's how he was judged, and it ruined part of his life after the war. I mean, I think I'm a grandson of a few very paranoid young people that decided to escape, in early '41, whilst their older, sensible neighbors were sitting on the porches and saying basically, we remember Germans 20 years ago and they were cultured and civilized. Yeah. Do we knock paranoia too much? Does it have a role in self-defense and rescuing people from those situations? And how do you balance that in a time of peace when it clearly does have these negative impacts?
No, I understand, and I think it's a good question. My thought on this will be the one that Goethe, Vrba, his first wife, said to me. She said that she told me lots of stories of his post-war paranoia, which caused great trouble for him professionally. It's all in the book, which I hope you're going to read. But she said to me, a lot of people think Rudy was made paranoid by Auschwitz, that going through Auschwitz made him paranoid. And she said, no, I don't think that's right. She said, I think it was because he was paranoid that he survived Auschwitz, because he didn't trust anybody. Now, I qualify that this way, which is Rudy, and I've interviewed quite a few Holocaust survivors over the years, and there will be other people in this room, I'm looking at Livia, who know this better than I do, but one thing I've noticed is Holocaust survivors will resist very strongly the question of what was it that enabled you to survive, and they almost always will say luck, and that random, arbitrary, and Rudy was the same. by the way, and it's a very important principle to them because they don't want to imply that somehow the people who did not survive lacked this quality or that quality. And again, when you read the book, I think you'll see it is so random. There are moments in his story where really a millimeter here, a millimeter there, it would have been him who was killed, not the person next to him or the person next to him on that side. So, you know, that's the first thing that has to be said. It's arbitrary and random. In terms of, though, for example, his escape, as you'll see when you read the book, there were 3 or 4 opportunities to attempt an escape, which Rudy passed up because he wasn't sure he could trust the people involved. Now, that was a sort of paranoid cast of mind, because actually they seemed quite plausible, and other Jewish prisoners did take that risk, and you know, you'll see when you read it, it didn't work out. So in a way, it was a deep distrust that had come out of experience, and yes, it did enable him to survive. On your larger point about do we knock it kind of thing, look, I do think that everybody who is the descendant of somebody who got out of those places, including actually even in, you know, Russia or Belarus or Ukraine in the 1890s, as the case of my family, you know, we are the descendants of the pessimists. They were the ones who didn't think it looked good and got out. And the descendants of the optimists are not here, because there weren't any descendants. The optimists who said, look, it will work out, it didn't work out. So I think there is something. I do try and explain this to people now when I'm talking to non-Jewish audiences about why Jews are so vigilant about anti-Semitism, etc. You know, there were other strains, other branches of our family tree that were more optimistic, but they didn't make it. So we're left with us.
I'm going to take one more question from the gentleman here.
You may think this is a little bit lighthearted, but apropos looping back to the question of when's the movie coming out, who would you cast as Rudy?
Gosh. Well, I mean, I think it would have to be somebody much, much younger than anybody I've ever heard of, because the thing, I mean, kids may know, but the thing that I do make a point of when I tell the story, maybe I haven't done it enough today, I said his age a few times, is how extraordinarily young he was. He was 17 when he arrived in Auschwitz, 19 when he escaped. He was a boy. He knew, you know, what does an 18-year-old know of the world when he is confronted with the worst that human history had ever served up? And yet his youth was really relevant because, and so it would have to be a very, very young actor. I mean, you know, the guy was in Normal People. I don't know his name. Somebody will know. He did cross my mind. But he's, you know, he's probably too old. I mean, it would have to be a 17 or 18-year-old.
Or Timothy Chalamet.
Yeah, I mean, somebody mentioned him, although somebody else told me that he's not strong enough. I mean, Rudy was very physically strong. The thing about it that I would say about this age point, and maybe this will be the last thing I say, that those people who were exposed to this story, who acted on the warning and did do something, overwhelmingly were young. Other young people heard about the Vrba Vets report. Again, there's a very specific example which I mention in the book. People who had no dependence, no property, no stake in society, who had nothing to lose in a way, believed it and ran. And anybody who was older and established and had a life and roots, they couldn't believe it. And that pattern was repeated again and again. And that makes me think very, you know, about our own lives and about what we do and what we can bear to hear and what we can't bear to hear. And Rudy had 2 children from his first marriage, but then had a very happy marriage with a second wife, much, much younger, a generation younger than him, in Canada. So somebody, as his first wife put it, because her marriage to Rudy was terrible, but she was describing the second marriage, she said, he needed to be with someone from a different generation and a different continent. You know, he needed a new start. But they never had children. And she was keen to have children. And they talked about it, and he said, having children makes you so vulnerable. He knew how vulnerable he had been by having children you love. You can't risk everything if you have people who depend on you and you love. In a way, he was able to do the escape because there was nothing, nobody else that he was protecting or worried about. So his youth is central to the story, which is, I know you wanted to go lighter, which I haven't done. But it would have to be somebody, it'd be very nice, we should have this problem of casting. I will involve all of you for the casting sessions. It will be great fun, but it would have to be somebody very young because his youth is at the heart of the story, I think.
Thank you. Just before I hand over to Madeline, our chair, Olivia Marks-Waldman is here from HMDT, and just 1 minute about HMDT later this week, please. No, just 1 minute, it's late.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you, Jonathan, for a wonderful lecture. And thank you, Sandra, and the whole Miller family, because Sabina inspires me to do the work we do. Holocaust Memorial Day, as we've heard, is on Friday. I really encourage all of you very warmly to join us for the National Online Commemoration, which will be on Thursday, the 26th of January, Thursday this week. It's online. You can get the link on our website, www.hmd.org.uk. And as Jerry mentioned, on Friday, we are inviting everyone in the country to light the darkness, place a candle in your window safely, just before you light your Shabbat candles. As dusk falls, light the darkness. The candle will be a flame of remembrance for the millions of people murdered in the Holocaust and in subsequent genocides. And it will also be a light of solidarity with people today who still face prejudice and persecution just for who they are. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olivia.
Well, it falls to me to thank our speaker today, and I'd first like to thank Sandra, who, together with Gabriel Herman, set up this series of lectures in memory of Sabina Miller. And without doing that, we wouldn't have heard Jonathan tonight, and that was really something very special. I have not read the book, but I'm sure everybody in this room who hasn't will now be reading the book. But you brought up so many issues about how people cannot believe, about self-interest, about this incredible young man who just achieved so much by saving nearly 200,000 lives. And the way you present everything as a journalist, looking at all sides of the story, was fascinating to me. You don't just take one set of facts. You talked about the Hungarian, you've looked at both sides, all sides of what he had as a life. So thank you very much. Very grateful to you for coming tonight. Thank you.
Excellent.